"Adriana, what the hell is this?" Christina was indignant, looking reproachfully at the nurse. That day the girl had made an irreparable blunder and knew perfectly well that the consequences could be the most unpredictable. But could she have done otherwise? Of course not. Unlike many of her colleagues, Adriana perceived the oath she had taken as a nurse as something very important. She was convinced that every person involved in medicine had a duty to help anyone in need. Whether it was a wealthy man with a solid car or a homeless person who was brought in literally from the street. It doesn't matter. Any person deserves a respectful attitude, even if he was in a difficult life situation. And a doctor should not leave to the mercy of fate the one to whom they just have to extend a professional helping hand. But not everyone adhered to this point of view. Adriana has worked in the local hospital for quite a long time and has repeatedly witnessed how people without documents and money are literally thrown out of the door. Who's here again? Another Adriana colleague was indignant when she went out into the corridor and saw people of no fixed abode lying on the bench. Adriana was perplexed when she encountered such attitudes towards people. For her, it was completely unacceptable. But she dared to ask the question, why not help a person, whoever he was? The girl received approximately the same answers. There are so many of them here, the head doctor grumbles unhappily. If we save everyone, there will be no time to help normal patients. And what do they need this life for? It's just an existence, to keep wandering the streets and looking for food. It's ridiculous. If God's got his hands on it, it must have been his will. It's a good thing for people like them. They won't have to suffer anymore. Such cruelty and cynicism was beyond Adriana's comprehension. She could never think and reason about people like that. After all sorts of things happen in life. And not all the people who found themselves at the bottom necessarily made that choice themselves. Some were simply deceived, and some were not too far-sighted and cared more for others than for themselves, which led to such an initial and miserable existence. Situations are different, and it is simply impossible to foresee everything. After all, these businesslike doctors are not immune to life's tragedies and vicissitudes. Adriana herself did not grow up in a palace. Throughout her life, the girl was surrounded by such a contingent that she was not surprised by alcoholics or marginalized people. Partly she treated such people with understanding. But what kind of life can there be when there is hopelessness all around? The dormitory, where Adriana had lived since birth, was hardly suitable for a decent existence. And it wasn't just the stinky corridors with rats and cockroaches running around, it was the neighborhood. Half a blessing, when among the neighbors are a lot of elderly people who are simply not able to take care of themselves. Alcoholics, drug addicts, and just plain down and out personalities are another matter. Adriana's family was one of the most decent in this gray brick building with fireplaces, rusty balconies, and 20 apartments per floor that looked more like cages. The girl lived with her mother in a small 18-meter apartment that hadn't been renovated in at least 30 years. Now it was just the two of them occupying this shabby dwelling. A few years ago, mother and daughter had to share the already meager living space with her grandmother. It was simply unreal to fit in such a cramped space and even to organize any kind of acceptable life. When out of 20 apartments and 19 live marginalized people, cockroaches and other delights of life are inevitable. And if the girl's mother, Betty, who had no education or indecent work, has long since come to terms with her horrible existence, then her daughter, she definitely did not want such a fate. Therefore, she protected Adriana from the nuances of social life and insisted that she should study well and enter the institute. The profession of a doctor was not chosen by chance. Betty was sure that it was medical education that would help Adriana make her way in life. They all make very good money. All she was doing was sentencing. And her when it came to where Adriana to go to study after school. You work, you get some practice, and eventually you'll get on your feet. At least it will definitely be stable, without ups and downs that you absolutely don't need. Adriana was in complete agreement with her mother, but it was not so easy to enter the medical faculty and get a higher education without connections and money. The girl understood this, so she decided to leave school after the 9th grade and go to college. Betty was strongly opposed to such a decision. The woman insisted that her daughter should go to an institute. "I don't understand why you don't believe in your own strength." The woman was indignant. "What kind of infantilism is this? What will you be after this college? All your life as a nurse and doctors to serve." "Mom, why are you being like this?" Adriana Betty parried, "Why do you have to make things worse? I don't see what's so special about having insurance. Just imagine what will happen if I don't get into college. Then I'd have to go to work, and then I'll get sucked into all this. And then, as you put it, what would I be? Think about that instead of thinking that I'm going to go to college first. Right after I get my degree, I can get a job as a nurse. I'll have money, I'll start earning, and then, as I dreamed, I'll get a higher education and become a doctor." No matter how Betty persuaded her daughter, she still did what she thought was right. After graduating from 9th grade, Adriana went to college and then got a job as a nurse at the local district hospital. The job didn't pay much. Betty did nothing but remind her daughter that it wasn't what she dreamed of or aspired to. But what could be done? I had to make do with what I had. There wasn't enough time for anything else. Though Adriana never forgot that she had other goals, she had no time to realize them. Years passed, and the girl continued to work as a simple nurse, which generally suited her. Only that the payment would be a little higher, but about this had to only dream and put up with the meager reality in which Adriana had to exist. So it went on until one day in the hospital where Adriana worked, there was a very interesting and unusual case. In all the time of her medical practice, she had never encountered anything like this. She had to make decisions and act quickly and surely. There was simply no other way out. A person's life was at stake, but along with it the whole further career of Adriana and work in general. The girl realized that if the forgery was revealed, she would be in trouble. Christina will never forgive a simple nurse so bold and willful in behavior. But Adriana still could not do otherwise. It was not the way she had been brought up to leave a man to die to his fate. That day, several people from the street were brought to the hospital almost simultaneously. For a large medical facility, this was a very common occurrence. But since the local hospital was quite small, it was very problematic to provide care to such a large number of patients. One doctor on duty would obviously not cope with such a flood of duties, and Adriana came to her aid. The astute girl immediately noticed that all the patients were in very different states. If some got off with some light abrasions and scratches, conflicts with someone on the street, someone just fell and hurt his knees or hands. There were also those who, for one reason or another, suffered fractures. All the people present in the emergency room were completely different, but equally in need of help. True, there was one single person among them who was very different from the rest. Adriana immediately paid the closest attention to him, as well as to the fact that the doctor on duty paid absolutely no attention to him. And this the girl was not surprised at all. He looked like an unhappy man who was about to give his soul to God. It was obvious that he was a marginal, and the hospital did not like such people and tried to get rid of them at every opportunity. Who have they brought in again? Clara, who was on duty that day, was indignant. The woman was tired before she started her shift. She was always angry, and it was impossible to hear a kind word from Slaga on the kidnapped one. And Adriana knew it very well, but against all odds decided to lend a helping hand to a man who needed it. And instead of a decent, in the opinion of most of the hospital staff, on the operating table was a miserable vagrant who seemed to be about to leave this world because of blood loss. Adriana herself could not believe that she had managed to pull it all off. Fortunately, Clara was so tired and busy that the patients' faces were never memorized. She paid absolutely no attention to them at all. The woman didn't care about people. The most important thing for her was to finish her work quickly. At home, she was waiting for her sick mother, whom her daughter had to take care of. The atmosphere in the family was not hot. Conflicts had long since become commonplace and did not cause the woman absolutely no emotion. By nature, she was generally cold and indifferent, which with such a profession and such a way of life was not surprising at all. The woman was simply tired of everything that was going on in her life, and she would have been glad to change everything, but she couldn't. It was too late. Quitting her job wasn't an option. She needed the money like air. Otherwise, on what will she support her sick mother and daughter, who do not work? In parallel with her main job, the woman regularly visited sick people at home. Of course, for an extra fee, they fitted the necessary certificates and helped anyone who needed help, but only on condition that they could pay for it decently. But to the ordinary sick people, Clara treated either neutrally or badly. She didn't even hide it. the unnecessary burden. And that's how the woman perceived all those whom she had to help during duty was absolutely no use to her. But there was nothing she could do about it. It was her job, for which the woman received a stable salary. So she had nothing left but to accept her existence and work. She had no other choice. That day, absolutely nothing special happened. The woman was just saving another life. But when she realized that in the ward, where a normal person with all the necessary documents was supposed to go, there was an ordinary street bum, she was furious. She began to study in detail the documents of all the admitted patients only after all the urgent operations of first necessity had been carried out and all those who had applied to the hospital the day before had been treated. The woman was horrified when she discovered the discrepancy. She was so furious that Adriana became very frightened when Slaga grabbed her arm in the hallway and, taking her aside, began to express everything she thought of her. If Clara had never felt so angry in her life, Adriana had never been so afraid of anyone. She realized that the woman was not going to keep quiet about the incident, and soon what had happened would be known to the head doctor. "Are you completely crazy?" whispered at the girl. "Don't you realize that this is forgery, an official crime? And if I had not noticed, what the hell are you doing? How can you put other data in the card if a patient who had a full right to help by law died because he wasn't helped in time? I'd go to trial. I could have gone to jail. You don't think you're me, do you? How could you even think of doing something like that?" How could you? Adriana didn't know what to say. She knew that she had done something illegal when she had filled in the patient's card and entered the details of another person who was sitting in the same corridor waiting to be bandaged. Why run to the hospital for one cut on his leg? Adriana pondered indignantly as she watched a man about the same age as that unfortunate wounded vagrant sitting there playing on his phone as if nothing had happened. Couldn't those poor abrasions have been treated at home? But that's just one way of looking at it. On the other hand, both Adriana and her ward were very lucky that the stranger was so strong that after falling off his bike, he ran to the hospital, quickly filling out a patient card. Adriana asked to wait for the doctor in the corridor. "We have a heavy flow today," she said. "You'll have to wait. The doctor will be able to see you in about half an hour." "Okay." The man nodded calmly, who, as Adriana thought, was willing to sit in the hospital corridor all day just to see a doctor. "I'll wait, no problem." Adriana ran down the corridor to the end of the corridor where the poor tramp was lying. By now he couldn't even open his eyes, let alone move. The man was unconscious. His condition was so critical that he needed help immediately. A few more minutes and he would not have been saved. Adriana arrived just in time. "Clara," rather, exclaimed the girl as she flew into the doctor's office. "It's an emergency, an urgent case. A man is bleeding to death." The man has papers. The first thing asked the doctor, who knew that Adriana girl was stinging on the left and ready to help all the unfortunate and destitute, without any financial return. Clara, on the other hand, was principled. She kicked undocumented people out of the hospital. She didn't need all these problems that were not compensated for in any way. "Did you look at his policy?" The woman continued her questioning. "Did you take care of it?" "Yes," Clara nodded. "Here is the passport and the policy and everything you need. I've entered all the data in the card. Let's go quickly, please, I beg you very much. He could die." This tramp was not like the others of his kind. But not only was he extremely heavy for a homeless man, he was also too clean-cut and dense. Adriana immediately sensed that he didn't smell of anything. Despite the fact that he was dressed very scantily, and those clothes that covered his body were like rags. In terms of hygiene, the tramp was perfect, with the meager money that the poor man managed to beg from passers-by from time to time. He frequented the local bathhouse, where people like himself came to wash. Marginalized people. Everyone was allowed in. To visit the bathhouse, no documents were required, only payment, which was very modest. Allow yourself to wash could absolutely anyone, even the poorest and most degraded person. Therefore, he never smelled like a street bum, and it was not disgusting to be near him. Usually, when such people came to the hospital, the stench was all over the corridor. Adriana had long since gotten used to it. And even if there had been a man in the place of the man she'd rescued who'd swiped the disgusting odor, she'd still have reached out to him. The girl could not otherwise. What a sincere and kind person she was. and it had come out to hurt her, though it also depends on which side you look at it from. When Adriana defended an ordinary vagrant in front of Clara, she could not even imagine what was ahead of her. The very real irony of fate, which however this time played a good joke on her instead of an evil one. As soon as Clara discovered the forgery of documents, she immediately demanded that the stranger she operated left the hospital. And on what grounds should he continue to lie here? The woman was indignant. The information on the patient's card belongs to another patient. He's the one who should be in this room. Him, not this one. How can I put this delicately? Adriana, but how could you? How could you have the conscience to deceive me? What about me? Do you have any idea what Christina will say when she finds out? You'll be fired. Sacrificing your job for someone you forgot. That's absurd. You're insane, honestly. Adriana realized that she couldn't convince her to keep her mouth shut. The situation was too serious, too sensitive. The woman wouldn't go for it. And the patient, who had been sitting in the corridor for several hours instead of the promised half an hour, was very angry and already intended to scandalize the doctor and the nurse. Can you tell me, am I going to be admitted at all? He asked as he yanked Adriana walking down the corridor. I've been sitting here for 3 hours, if not longer. You haven't even approached me once. You think that's normal? My leg actually hurts. What the hell is going on here? The man's leg did hurt a lot, but that was nothing compared to what the poor tramp had to endure. And at that moment, Adriana couldn't think of anyone or anything else. The only thing she was interested in was the fate of the unfortunate tramp, who, after a complicated blood transfusion operation, simply could not be on the street again. Adriana wouldn't allow it and made another difficult decision, which, quite obviously, would cause Betty to protest quite reasonably. You're out of your mind. The woman exclaimed when her daughter told her what had happened. How could you even think of such a thing? What are you going to do now? They'll kick you out of the hospital. They won't hire you in any other hospital. And then where are you going? Medical career's over, and you were going to go to medical school. Betty was horrified by the situation. She hadn't expected Adriana to be so stupid. The woman knew that her daughter had sympathized with vagrants and the unemployed, the poor and destitute, and helped them in any way she could, but only to the best of her ability. Now Adriana had clearly overstepped the mark, crossed that line, beyond which it was in no way allowed to go. And the consequences of all this were quite obvious and very disappointing for her. The people I helped before my mother were not on the verge of life and death, Adriana exclaimed indignantly when her mother rebuked her for what she had done. And this one? Would you have seen him? There wasn't a living thing on him. What do you think I should have done? Abandon a poor man to his fate? I don't know, Adriana. I don't know, sighed Betty, who realized that her daughter had ruined her medical career. But it's definitely not a good idea to bring him home with us. If you want my opinion, you know I'm totally against it. And I don't want some homeless bum living under our roof. You don't know what kind of person he is. Maybe he's some kind of gangster, or maybe even worse. And you, who so easily told me that we have to pick up a strange man from the hospital, and even without documents. That's absurd. Adriana, it's absurd as hell. But the girl was adamant. She had already decided everything for herself. The conversation with Christina had aroused absolutely no emotion in her. Adriana knew in advance what the head doctor would tell her. It was too obvious. Therefore, when Adriana heard that she was fired, she was not surprised at all. And we're advising you, girl, the head doctor added as her thrown speech came to an end. Don't ever try to get a job in this field again. After what you've done, you'll have to say goodbye to medicine once and for all. You've set not only yourself up, but all of us, including me. And be thankful that the patient whose records you used didn't realize his data was being misused. Well, that's it. This conversation is over and done. I am waiting for your letter of resignation, and if you don't give it in the next few days, I will be forced to fire you. Adriana realized that she had no other choice after being fired from the local hospital, and it was unlikely that she would ever be able to continue her medical career. It was a real blow to her. But if she had done otherwise and let the man go to the other world without even trying to help, the girl would feel even worse than now, when once and for all she was saying goodbye to her dream and parting with all plans for life. Or was it not her dream after all? The wishes of a mother who wanted a better life for her daughter and simply did not know how to achieve it other than through higher education. Adriana didn't have time to think about it at that moment as she took Christina's letter of resignation. She saw Benjamin take the tramp, who had been so hard to get out of the ward. He was on duty that day, and Clara had time to tell the man about the incident that had happened at the hospital. "On my shift I kicked him out and he was gone," she said. "So be it, let him lie down after the operation." "Well, you're on duty and escort him out. He has nothing to do in our hospital. He has absolutely no reason to do so. He doesn't even have any grounds, he doesn't even have an ID." Benjamin was as indifferent and tired of life as Clara. So he had absolutely no concern for the fate of the unfortunate man. As soon as he came on shift, made his rounds, went straight to his room to escort him out. By that time, the tramp had already opened his eyes and was even capable of realizing reality. He understood where he was and even remembered what had happened to him and why he was in the hospital, where he had crawled after he had fought with the local bums who had reclaimed their long-occupied territory with their usual fury. "I didn't know you were here. If I had, I wouldn't have come. It's just that people say there's a lot of good food thrown away by this dump. And it's not just you who want to eat, it's me too. I live in an abandoned house not far from here. I'm always happy to help. You can come to me if you need anything. I'm always ready to lend a hand. After all, we're in this together. Why should we be angry with each other?" The man tried to talk to vagrants like himself. Humanly speaking, he was sure they could understand him. But he was very much mistaken and realized it only when they all pounced on him. The man had not expected such a development. At first he fought back and tried to crawl away from a bunch of insane people who were ready to tear anyone's throat for the patronage of the garbage dump located near the rich house. But after a few minutes, Lesha slid pitifully. The pain was so strong that the man could hardly feel his body. And with each blow he was losing touch with reality more and more. It was as if the world around him had distanced itself from him, turning into something completely intangible and unconscious that was completely inaccessible to him. "Let's explain him some more," the man with the long beard suggested, so that he wouldn't get into other people's territory. The man could not remember how long he had spent in that gatehouse, which he had stumbled upon by accident when he had lost everything he had in his life. In truth, he didn't remember anything at all. Neither who he was from nowhere, nor how he had ended up in the dump where he woke up and opened his eyes. And certainly the unfortunate vagrant did not know that there were any divisions of territory among the homeless. For a long time he lived a very ordinary vagrancy in life. Food to beg for in the neighboring small cafe or near the stores. Kind people were almost always ready to help. There was not a single day that someone did not give something to the poor vagrant. He was grateful, but he couldn't even tell me his name. To reproduce the story of how he found himself on the street was out of the question. The memory of the man was gone, and no matter how hard he tried to remember who he was and where he came from, he couldn't. And some time later, after several unsuccessful attempts to stir up his own memory, the man stopped trying to pull out of the depths of subconsciousness what was closed and inaccessible to him. And there was no time for that. Now his life consisted of one continuous survival. Every day the vagabond had to think about where to get food and how to organize at least some acceptable life. When, after wandering around the neighborhood, he came across a high-rise house, near which there was a huge garbage dump, even rejoiced. This place was inhabited by obviously not poor people, who often threw out not just leftovers, but whole containers with all sorts of unnecessary stuff, unnecessary for them, but not poor and destitute vagrants, who came here every morning to find something to keep them afloat for another day. And it was like this all the time. Every morning and every evening was similar to the previous ones, because the house was indeed inhabited by very wealthy and respectable people, who were not too happy to have garbage flying around and bums constantly swarming around. The dumpster was eventually moved a little farther away and made covered. Now getting there was not so easy and allowed. It was only for the chosen ones who could, so to speak, win back this territory and agree with the head of the local Hoa. "To hell with you," waved his hand a man of small stature, which was not too much pleased with the fact that on the site of the demolished old house built this skyscraper. The rich dwelling did look very incongruous against the surroundings. But what could be done? As the builders decided, so they did. What about the people? Who gives a damn what they think? The neighborhood was developing, and in time the developers planned to buy out all the neighboring territories to build another residential complex. The place was really not bad, so the demand for apartments was not long in coming. Some of them bought for the future, and some of them moved in immediately. And what difference does it make where to live if you leave the house only accompanied by guards or assistants and go everywhere by car? The main thing is the view from the windows of most apartments is very decent, and the quality of housing is quite acceptable and corresponds to the declared level. And the rest are already details, which can be temporarily closed your eyes. The neighborhood should have been settled anyway, and when it happens, the contingent will be completely changed and the infrastructure will be completed. In the meantime, so to speak, for the future. Gangs of local homeless people quickly took notice of this tasty place. Some residents took out of the house whole bags of food, things and even equipment, which could be profitably rented or sold. The problem with the fact that phones, laptops and other things are accepted in the brackets exclusively by passport. The homeless have long ago solved it. They everywhere, and always, and with everyone knew how to negotiate. Well, what to do? As they say, if you want to live, you will not learn so much. And the homeless had to find a way to get by. The same tried to do in a strange vagrant nicknamed Stranger. This name was given to him by the owner of the local cafe, who from time to time gave him food. So since you can't remember your name or even guess, you're a stranger. He laughed. That's how it works. How else would it work? That's what we'll call you in the neighborhood. Or you can come up with a name for yourself. I don't know how you plan to live on. You've got to get out of this. Maybe you're some oligarch who's been kicked out of the house by his wife. Maybe, sighed the man, who supported such conversations solely out of politeness. He didn't want to discuss his past or his future with strangers. Not because he was secretive, but because he didn't know anything himself. And if it hadn't been for that fateful incident when he was attacked by a local criminal group, which in essence consisted of people like him, who had sunk to the bottom of life, it was unlikely that the man would ever be able to return to his former life. What happened to him was truly terrible and monstrous. And it was not only the fact that the poor tramp was thrown out of the hospital in the terrible condition in which he was at that moment. His past, which would have come out sooner or later anyway, had at some point come over the man's head. But it happened much later than he left the hospital and at the most unexpected moment. The man no longer believed that his memory would ever come back to him. When he was interrupted by Smith, wounded, and the unfortunate man was thrown out of the hospital room, the tramp felt such despair that he could hardly hold back his tears. Adriana intercepted him almost immediately. The girl was not even indignant. Benjamin's behavior, as well as the attitude towards the patients of the sclera. It did not surprise her at all. Adriana had long been accustomed to the fact that no one cared about anything in the hospital. From the outside it looked monstrous. And for the staff, who faced this kind of thing every single day, it was all quite familiar. When Benjamin saw Adriana, he grinned wryly. He asked, Quit, mumbled Adriana, who had absolutely no desire to have this conversation. She no longer asked, but demanded that Benjamin let go of the vagrant, whom he held tightly by the arm, pushing him forward. Are you going to get your hands on him? The man grinned. An enviable groom. You can say that again. Adriana ignored the man's unkind remark. She saw no point in engaging in dialogue with him. Benjamin wouldn't say anything clever or good anyway, and to waste time on idle chatter and tolerate the man's bile spewing in her direction, Adriana wasn't going to. Taking the tramp by the hand, she led him out of the hospital and hailed a cab. On foot, the man simply wouldn't make it to Adriana's house, and it wasn't very far. But the poor tramp had so little strength that he could hardly stop on his feet. When they arrived home, Betty could hardly conceal her indignation. She realized that Adriana was not to argue. If she had made up her mind about something, she would certainly do what she thought was right. Recently, Adriana had begun to show her temper more and more often. For the first time, the girl defended her opinion when she said that she would not go to the institute and first finish college, and since then she behaved as she wanted. And no matter how hard Betty tried to convince her daughter that she was committing an absurd, ill-considered act, she never succeeded. It was only over time that the woman was able to change her attitude towards the tramp. This happened a few months after the man moved in with them. He behaved more than decently. He helped Betty with household chores, went grocery shopping, cleaned. The man tried his best to thank Adriana for her support and help. She gave him a new name. Adriana didn't like that the tramp was impersonal. It didn't feel human, so she started calling him William. He didn't seem to care. He couldn't remember his real name anyway. It's not like he'd ever remember it. Time flew so fast after he was discharged from the hospital that William didn't even notice how the months flew by. Sometimes it seemed to him that everything that had happened to him had happened just yesterday. But in fact, time was running out, and he had to move on with his life. How William didn't know. Adriana didn't even try to talk to him about it. She thought that the man had not yet recovered enough to deal with such serious issues and problems. Betty, on the other hand, insisted that William just needed to find out what had happened to him and find his roots. The woman never ceased to be amazed that things had turned out this way in his life. All she could do was pester Adriana with questions about the man and his past. Had no one been looking for him for so long? She wondered. A man has been living without a roof over his head for an unknown amount of time, and no one has grabbed his documents. But it also does not happen. Everyone has some relatives, friends, at least someone. He can't be so lonely that no one noticed his disappearance. The woman insisted that Adriana and William go to the police and, so to speak, find out everything on the spot. If the man was wanted by his relatives and for some unknown reason they couldn't find him, it would help them to finally meet their loved one. But if not, then it is a completely different issue and requires other measures for resolution. He will not live with us for the rest of his life in such an illegal situation, the woman reasoned. If you have brought him to our house, you must help him. Adriana, this is not a joke. Sooner or later this situation has to be resolved. So why not do it now? In the end, Adriana agreed with her mother, who was, in fact, right. William was not yet old enough to give up on his life. If he found his relatives and friends, and they turned out to be decent people who were genuinely worried about their relative, he could start his life with a clean slate. And if the man's memory came back to him, then everything would be completely different. But it was still necessary to find the ends. Without that, there was nowhere to go. William's whole future life depended directly on whether he would be able to find his relatives and friends, to find out who he was and where he came from. Of course, Adriana had no thoughts of kicking him out. But for the time the man had spent in her and her mother's family, he had become a real close person to them. Now it wasn't just Adriana. But Betty also sympathized with him, so she wanted the situation in the man's life to be cleared up as soon as possible. After listening to Adriana and William, the police officers were not at all surprised. This story was, if not a common one, at least one of the several 100,000 that they had already heard many times in this office. "We will, of course, take your statement," the investigator said meaningfully, when Adriana and William had finished their unhappy narrative. "But I'm not sure we'll be able to find any leads. Unfortunately, you don't remember anything. We'll put out an APB. But I don't think it'll do much good. Unfortunately, there are a lot of cases like this. And if no one still hasn't realized that you've disappeared, your relatives, who you probably have, may not be happy that you've turned up." The investigator had voiced exactly what Adriana had feared so much. She was hesitant to share such thoughts with either William or her mother. Similar thoughts had crossed Betty's mind, but she kept them to herself. What to say to a man who had been abandoned to his fate in a terrible state? The woman was more than certain that someone had simply gotten rid of William. He was no longer needed. Or there were more important interests behind it all, such as material interests, which was quite possible. Nobody ends up on the street just out of the blue. It just doesn't happen. William had been helped by someone, and it was necessary to find out who this so-called virtuous person was who had thrown the poor, unconscious man out on the street without a penny of money. It didn't take long for all these questions to be answered. When after 2 weeks Adriana realized that from the investigator should not expect any progress in this complex case, she decided to hire a private detective. "You're out of your mind," Betty exclaimed when her daughter shared her plans with her. "It costs a lot of money. We don't have that kind of money. You're making pennies at your store. I'm not even talking about me. If you decide to take out a loan, imagine how long it'll take you to pay it back. Think about whether it's worth it." I don't think it's worth it." Adriana thought the opposite. She was sure that there was no other way out and that this was the only way to help William, especially since he was already ready to act. William was very uncomfortable to be living in someone else's house. He felt very uncomfortable. Like any normal person, the man wanted a simple, normal human life, which he was sure he had once had, but he had lost it. And now he really wanted to know how and under what circumstances it had happened. At the time, the man could not even imagine how much it would upset him and drive him into a corner. This information one clue, and he remembered everything. Yes, and the private detective played not the least role in all this. Until the moment when the man found himself in such a monstrous life situation, he was the most ordinary person. He was married when he was still young and had lived in a happy marriage all his conscious life. And the man was not a bad father. He always taught his daughter and son goodness and justice. He explained that one should live according to one's conscience and, if possible, help those who need it, not staying away from other people's misfortune. And of course, to take care of those who for one reason or another are unable to take care of themselves. Years of life together with his beloved wife flew by so quickly that Michael was the man's name. In fact, did not even have time to blink an eye. He was sure that he and his wife are still quite young and unlikely to face any serious health problems in the coming years. The children had grown up, and the couple could finally start living for themselves. But everything turned out to be not so rosy as they gave themselves fantasists. In the first place, the youngest son, unlike his daughter, could not decide what he wanted to do in life. Whatever Ethan took on, he failed at. Everything fell out of hand, and this gradually led the young man to depression, apathy, and ennui. Over time, he became closed and withdrawn, almost never left the house, and did not contact anyone. He was very ashamed of being such a failure, and he was afraid to admit even to himself that it was not the thing he was taking on, or any other thing, but it was him. He was to blame for all his troubles. And Ethan's main mistake was that he had too much ambition and very little ammunition to realize it. He took on things he couldn't handle. And when once again Obama took, he was angry not so much at himself, but at the whole world, including his parents, who were absolutely not guilty of anything in front of him. The problems of the spouses did not end there. In their lives there was also the second. And this circumstance outweighed all the problems that ever took place in the family. After Cindy was diagnosed with a serious illness, everything else ceased to have any meaning for Michael. At no time in his life had he ever experienced such intense emotions as he did then. Immediately after the results of the examination became known, the man called his daughter Kathy, who had gone abroad right after graduation. He was in a panic and didn't know what to do, and badly needed the support his son was simply unable to provide. "Dad, please calm down, everything is fixable." Kathy reassured the man. "Nothing terrible has happened yet. We'll heal, and Mom will definitely get better. I'm sure of it. If necessary, we'll get her into a foreign clinic. I promise you I'll do everything I can to help her." Kathy had serious plans for her life from the start. Unlike her brother, she never floated in the clouds or dreamed rosy dreams. In her early youth, Kathy persistently pursued her goal. She wanted not only to get a decent education abroad, but also to marry well. The goals set by the girl realized quite quickly. She never spent precious time just for nothing. Therefore, immediately upon arrival abroad, not only studied, but also actively familiarized herself with men. And she found the one she wanted. He himself was a Russian emigrant, so she could communicate with Liam Kathy easily and at ease. They spoke the same language, and a relationship developed almost immediately after meeting. Kathy saw a completely different standard of living to the one she had always aspired to. Her mother's illness could be a major obstacle to the long-awaited wedding, a date that was about to be set. Liam was very sensitive and reverent about family values and would hardly adequately handle the fact that they would be celebrating their nuptials, while the future mother-in-law, whom Liam knowingly had respect for, is on the verge of life and death. Kathy did not tell her lover about what was going on in her family until the last. At first, when she first learned that her mother was ill, she wanted to ask him for help, but Cindy flatly refused to go abroad. "My home is here," she said, "and I'll be treated here too. And if I die, then so be it." The woman's relationship with her daughter was complicated, and Kathy's move abroad only aggravated the already rather chilly communication. The mother had never shared her daughter's ambitions. The woman was convinced that Kathy was doing wrong, and one day she would realize it. Cindy had always loved her son more. Ethan, who disappointed his parents more and more every day, was the truest light in the window for her. Towards the end of her life, the woman realized that he was unlikely to live up to her and her husband's expectations, but her attitude towards her daughter did not change at all. She didn't want to accept help from Kathy, and she wouldn't do it, and it wouldn't have helped. Cindy was doomed. It was too late for her to realize it and see a doctor. After his wife died, Michael was left alone with Ethan, and Kathy flew back abroad. Gradually, the man's life became a living hell. The daughter didn't want to get involved. She sent money so that her father and brother could maintain a decent lifestyle, and thought that was enough. No matter how many times her father asked her to come at least once in a while, it was useless. Kathy cited a lack of time and was refusing, as he watched his brother gradually sink to the bottom, and her father trying with all his might to pull him out by his ears. She didn't feel like it. Ethan was becoming more unbearable by the day. The sudden death of his mother, whom he loved so much, had hit his already calculated psyche. The young man had lost all hope of any acceptable existence. Instead of pulling himself together, going to school or work and proving to everyone, and first of all to himself, that he could do anything, Ethan went on a spree. The father was unable to cope with his son, who did not put him in anything. No matter how many times Michael tried to talk to him, it was useless. As soon as it came to talking about his son's behavior, about his future, which under such circumstances was very vague, Ethan began to get angry and snapped at him. The nation. Every conversation ended in a scandal. And eventually Michael got fed up with it all and stopped lecturing his son. They lived as neighbors until the young man brought a girl into the house. The father reacted to this extremely negatively. The girl caused him nothing but disgust. She behaved abominably. Michael was shocked when he entered the bathroom in the morning and found dirty laundry on the floor. It was out of line. And the man still decided to talk to his son on the subject of his cohabitation with a Frank Net, which has not the slightest idea about the elementary rules of decency. But this conversation did not lead to anything. Michael, only irritation at Ethan, anger and aggression, which nowhere disappeared. The young man was still in a very difficult emotional state. Only now his loneliness was asked by a certain Kelly, who was clearly more interested in the money and apartment sent by Kathy than in relations with the unimportant Ethan. "I can live with who I want to live with," the young man told his father. "I'm an adult, and you don't have to tell me what to do. This apartment is just as much mine as it is yours. I'm not interfering with your life, and you don't interfere with mine. And you stay out of my business, mind your own." Complaints also had absolutely no effect. When the father told his daughter about what was going on in the family, she only grudgingly hummed. "Dad, well, really I do not understand. What do you want from him about the territory?" Into the tube Kathy, having heard the father. "He's an adult, you can't fix him. The only thing you can do in this situation is to move away from him. You have enough money. If you need my help, I'm here for you. You know that's not a problem. But I'm not going to come down here and lecture him. Let him live his life the way he wants to." Michael couldn't abandon his son. He was worried about his fate. And watching what was happening to the young man, the man's heart was breaking. The indifference of his daughter also upset him very much. Kathy had a life of her own. When Michael talked to her, he had the impression that on the other end of the wire was a completely alien, extraneous young woman who had nothing to do with their family. That was partly true. Kathy not only didn't want to solve her family's problems, she couldn't. She didn't care about it at all. She was already married by the time her brother went completely off the rails. Kathy's husband was a wealthy man. He wanted a solid family with many children to raise. And at that moment, Kathy was only interested in how her future life would turn out. She was planning to become a mother and was completely and utterly focused on that. Moving her father into her husband's home was out of the question. She didn't need any extra burdens, so she didn't even mention it. From time to time, Liam asked his wife how her brother and brother-in-law were doing. Kathy answered evasively that everything was fine. She didn't want to go into the details that she knew about. Her husband was always wondering why Michael didn't come to visit them, as if they weren't family. He reasoned, "Sometimes I get the impression that your father is not interested in your life at all." But that's not normal, agreed. Kathy cited Michael's poor morale after Cindy's death. "You see, he loved her very much." She sighed sadly. "He thought they'd live together for the rest of their lives. And she's gone so soon. He didn't care about us, and it's unlikely he'll ever care about us again. All my father has left in his life are memories. So there's no point in talking about it. We can't help him anyway." As time went on, the relationship between my father and Kathy faded away. If Michael called his daughter, he would immediately start complaining about his miserable life or his son. And this very much tires the young woman. All thoughts that were occupied exclusively with her own life and family. In the end, Kathy confined herself to sending money on a regular basis. She no longer wanted to get into the problems of the family and believed that she had already done enough to make things better after the death of her mother. It wasn't her fault that her brother had grown up to be an incapable and temperamental man. When the daughter stopped calling, Michael realized that she did not want to communicate with him. Certain conclusions from the situation made, and Kelly, who regularly warmed her ears when the father talked to his son and knew absolutely everything that was going on in the family. She realized that it was time to act. The girl had big plans for Ethan, the realization of which Michael prevented. She needed an apartment and money, but not just a roof over her head and a husband to provide for her, a sole proprietorship. Kelly wasn't going to commit to Ethan for the long haul, and he, to tell the truth, was only looking for comfort around her. The young man wanted to abstract from the problems, forget, and convinced himself that he was focused on the family. Therefore, he simply did not have time to build a career and make money. Ethan unashamedly stole money from his father's card, from which he knew the PIN code. Michael knew about it and periodically changed cards, but it didn't help. Ethan still found ways to get access to them. And as soon as the father transferred money from the account to plastic, the son immediately robbed him of every last penny. The man was both hurt and ashamed, but he felt so powerless that he could not put in the extreme naked sun. In Michael's place, there was nothing left but to tolerate all his antics. His life had turned out in such a way that Ethan turned out to be the only person close to him. His wife was lying in the grave, his daughter lived abroad, and she had absolutely nothing to do with her father, but his son was there for him. And this largely predetermined the attitude towards him. Michael forgave Ethan a lot, which he later had to regret very much. The man could not even imagine what his son was capable of for the sake of money, and Ethan needed it more and more acutely. Kelly twirled him around as she wished. Every day her appetite grew, and Ethan had no choice but to satisfy it. Kelly became more and more insolent every day, and finally began to hint to Ethan that it would be a good idea to free the apartment from her father's presence. The girl even told the young man how to do it. Sending Michael to a nursing home or boarding house was too premature. He wasn't that old yet. He doesn't have any serious illnesses either. But it's quite possible to help him become homeless, if you put enough effort into it. And Kelly was ready to do it. The stakes were too high for an orphan girl who didn't have Nicola's backyard. To get an entire apartment and a husband who lives off his rich sister is the truest of fortunes. Sooner or later, Ethan would have to suffer the same disappointing fate as his father. But that was in the future, and at that moment he didn't think about it at all. He didn't care. Ethan wasn't ready to give up on Kelly because he'd grown too attached to her. And his low self-esteem was constantly weighing on him. His head was just spinning with thoughts that no other girl would ever pay attention to him again. And Kelly was his only chance not to be alone. And loneliness was something he dreaded very much. His father had long been just a roommate to him. The relationship between them left much to be desired, so the young man did not have to count on his moral support. And Kelly was perfect. She looked Ethan in the mouth and listened attentively to every word he said. Yes, she did it for profit, but it suited him just fine. Ethan couldn't have imagined that the whole situation would go this far, and he wasn't in the habit of thinking about the consequences. Kelly, meanwhile, having obtained the tacit consent of her roommate, began to slowly pour Peter in. Michael. Oh. A good acquaintance of the girl worked in a pharmacy, and at her request was able to get a drug with which Michael gradually went crazy. Every day Kelly slipped it to the man in small doses, and so it went on until he began to lose touch with reality. Watching everything that was going on, Ethan realized that it wasn't just that. But he didn't interfere. In fact, the young man had given his consent to what Kelly was doing, and he could not resist it, nor did he want to. Ethan didn't have the moral strength to resist the girl he had put around his neck and let her do everything she could and couldn't. Now he only had to humbly watch the nightmare that was going on in his life and around him. So Kelly took root in their father's apartment with ease, and when the drug, which she quietly pichalavayat Michael, began to act, the girl realized that the victory is very close. The man often forgot who he was and where he was. Sometimes he could leave home and for several hours wander aimlessly through the streets. Once Michael could hardly find his own house at all and come back. When he told his son about it, he just shrugged indifferently and said, "No wonder, you are not a youth, go to a doctor." This continued until the moment came when Michael could not find his way home at all. He stopped passers-by to ask for directions, but caught himself thinking that he couldn't even remember his own address. And that day became a fateful day in the man's life. It was the beginning of his vagrancy. Desperate and depressed, he still remembered that he had a son, and in his heart he hoped that sooner or later Ethan would find him. But it didn't happen. The man was left on the street without a penny of money, all alone. If the relationship with Kathy would have remained at least at the level when she regularly called her father, if she would have had any suspicion when her brother called her and asked her to transfer money to his card under the pretext that her father's eyesight had become worse, and it was difficult for him to use the ATM and withdraw money. It would seem to be a banal, inadequate excuse that would put any normal person in a stupor. But not Kathy, who was too busy dealing with her own issues and family problems. Ethan wasn't even tasked with finding his father when he disappeared without a trace. He was too busy preparing for his wedding to Kelly. And, to tell the truth, partly the young man was even glad that now no one would look at him with reproach and paint him for the way he lived. On this case did not end. After the wedding, Kelly began to gradually survive in Ethan. She realized that it would be strange if she disappeared without a trace. So at first she just tried to convince her husband to sign over at least part of the apartment to her, and then as it goes themselves will sort it out. But Ethan did not want to do this, and the girl waited and endured, until the moment came when she decided to go the same way as with Michael. She realized that her sister was unlikely to claim the inheritance. She had enough money already, and if she hadn't even inquired about her father's whereabouts in so long, she probably wouldn't be interested in the apartment that would be left after her brother disappeared. And so it came to pass. And Kathy was in complete ignorance until she received a call from the neighbors telling her that the apartment had been sold. In the house where they lived, everyone knew each other. But when Michael disappeared from sight, the neighbors were sure that he had gone to his daughter, who lives abroad. The presence in the apartment of the girl Ethan also did not cause absolutely no suspicion and surprise. After all, a young man should somehow establish his personal life. But Ethan's disappearance and the subsequent quick sale of the apartment confused the neighbors. They sounded the alarm even when people flocked to the apartment like to a store to look at their potential future property. Claudia had Kathy's phone number, and so did the neighbor across the street. And when she called Kathy and told her what was going on, the young woman was shocked. By that time, Kathy and Liam already had a son, and she devoted all her time and attention to him. A trip to her native land was not part of her plans, but there was no choice. She had to have a serious and frank talk with her husband and tell him about the situation in her family. Liam was indignant. He sincerely did not understand how such monstrous events could have passed her by. "What are you going to do now?" asked the man after listening to his wife. "Where to look for your father, your brother? And what will happen to the apartment? And what about the apartment?" The man did not express to his wife everything that he thinks about it, so as not to offend her and not to fight. But in his head, he could not understand how it was possible to be so indifferent to his own father. Liam visited his parents once every few months, called them every day to see how they were doing. He'd guessed from the beginning that things weren't going well in the Kathy household, but he didn't want to go into details. Liam loved her very much and was willing to turn a blind eye to the fact that his wife's relationship with her father and brother left a lot to be desired, even though it went against his values and principles. Because Liam was a very wealthy man, He could solve the issue anywhere in the world, and he could not leave his wife alone with such a difficult life situation, even though she was wrong to ignore her family's problems for several years. "I'll go with you," he said uncompromisingly. When Kathy packed for home, I had already called my security chief. "I'm sure he'll have no trouble finding your father and brother. And this fugitive who survived will find them from the apartment. Especially since Klavdia Gorevna saw her. She'll be able to describe it. And a person, as they say, is not a needle in a haystack. She couldn't just disappear, and the man was right." By the time Kathy caught on and finally decided to get involved in her family's problems, Michael, who had been given the name William by Adriana, had already remembered everything. All the events of his life were restored in his memory one by one, and the man became unbearably painful from the realization of his naivety and stupidity, gullibility and carelessness. After all, if he had then put the naked son in his place, none of this would have happened. But he turned out to be too weak of character and without backbone to prevent the tragedy that had occurred in his family. Now, he didn't know where his son was or if he was even alive. Even before Kathy arrived, the man had managed to go to his old apartment and knew that it had been sold. Now there were complete strangers living in his apartment who were genuinely surprised by the visit of a stranger who was trying to find out the fate of the apartment. "We paid the money and registered the transaction," grudgingly muttered and opened the door, and the woman who immediately began to suspect that she could take away the apartment on which she and her husband had saved all their lives. "This is our property. We bought it honestly. We didn't cheat anyone. And what's going on in your family? That's not our problem. I've never seen you before in my life. Go away. I'm not going to let you take away what we've worked for." Michael's mind was reeling. How did Kelly manage to pull all this off when neither he nor his son were reported missing, dead? Neither he nor Ethan were recognized. How then could she sell the apartment as an owner who didn't exist? There was a clear forgery of documents. And the girl clearly had help from someone else too. She couldn't have done it on her own. It's too complicated. The man wasn't wrong in his reasoning. Kelly didn't want to go public, so she didn't officially recognize Michael and Ethan's disappearance. Instead, she turned to a lawyer she knew, who for a certain share helped her to pull off the whole scam. Sooner or later, Michael and Ethan would become officially dead anyway. It was inevitable. But by then, the apartment Ethan had supposedly signed over to Kelly would have already been sold. Ends in the water and impossible to find. And if Kathy hadn't intervened, everything would have gone smoothly. But alas, no matter how tight the rope, sooner or later the end will come. That's life. Everything secret sooner or later comes to light. Not 2 days later, Liam was provided with information about everything that had happened to Michael and Ethan. In all that time, Kathy had had absolutely no involvement in their lives. How his head of security had managed to get it all out, down to the smallest detail, God only knows. When Kathy asked about it, he evasively replied that nothing was impossible. And the most important thing was that they had managed to find their father and brother, and the rest was no longer so important and had absolutely no meaning at all. That day, when 3 expensive cars drove up to the house where Adriana lived with her mother and Michael, who was at a complete loss and did not know what to do next, Betty opened her eyes wide. She was looking out the window at that moment and immediately shouted to her daughter, who was in the room at that moment. "Adriana, look at that," exclaimed the woman. "I wonder who it is that such people have come. There have never been such people in our neighborhood. Somebody's got some rich relatives or something. Mom, what do you care?" Adriana dismissed it. "I don't know who's visiting who. What's it to us?" But when the doorbell rang, the girl froze. "Is it for us?" she asked, surprised, because she couldn't believe what was happening. There was no one else at the entrance, so Adriana had absolutely no doubt that it was the respectable man who had gotten out of the car a few seconds ago. "Who do you want?" Adriana asked in confusion as she opened the door. Kathy followed her husband upstairs. It was only when she entered the apartment that everything finally became clear. Michael came out into the hallway when he heard the noise, and when he saw his daughter, he cried. Kathy threw herself on his neck and hugged him tightly. Never once in her life had she felt so much for her father. Vetuanina Anatolievna and Adriana left correctly. They decided to leave them alone so that father and daughter could talk calmly about everything. and they had something to say to each other. "It happens," Betty muttered confusedly, when Adriana closed the door to the room. By that time, tears were welling up in the woman's eyes, so much so that she was touched by what was happening right down to the core of her being. And who would have thought how messed up things had turned out to be for them? Poor Michael. How should he live with all this now? This question the man had been asking himself ever since his memory came back to him, and he could not answer it even to himself. It was only when his daughter found him and came to visit him that he got some clarity. Now Kathy and I had to pull out of the swamp into which he had fallen through his own fault. Ethan, the head of security, had made inquiries about him as well, much to the dismay of both Kathy and Michael. Ethan was being treated in a psychiatric hospital. Unlike his father, he could not get out from under the influence of those potent drugs which fed him Kelly, and finally went down when, at the mercy of his wife, Ethan found himself outside the threshold of his home without money and documents. He completely lost control of himself, and he was placed in the hospital. There were no kind people to help him in any way. Neither Kathy nor Michael knew for sure if he would ever be able to go back to his old life. They just hoped and believed. If you realized the man would have come back sooner, he would have surely helped his son. But Michael had no memory of even having him. Bull. Ethan did not recognize his father or his sister. He was in such a serious condition that he did not even remember who he was. Relatives were out of the question. It took Ethan a very long time to regain consciousness and recover. He could hardly return to normal life. But along with the return of his memory came the realization of his own mistakes. Ethan was very remorseful to his family, to his father, who was at the bottom of his life because of his fault, and to his sister, who had been robbed and spent the money she sent him to fulfill the desires of a girl who never loved him and was with him only for profit. Liam wanted to intervene in this situation, but his participation was not required. Kelly had many other serious misdemeanors and felonies, for which she had gone to jail. The story with Ethan was not the only one in her life. The girl for a very long time has been engaged in various criminal activities. This was one of the most serious, but not the first. She's not the least bit remorseful. Everyone survives as they can. That is how Kelly reasoned even after she found herself in the hands of justice, and there was no changing it. Too strong was the resentment of life in her problems and miserable situation. Kelly blamed absolutely everyone but herself. And not only did she profit from others, but it cost them. God was her judge. Ethan sighed every time he replayed the story in his memory and pondered whether things could have turned out differently. Probably could have. At least, that was the conclusion he'd come to. But only if he'd been a different person himself. But Ethan was who he was. It had taken him a great deal of time and effort to change. It happened only after a few years, when he finally managed to find a business to his liking, in which he immersed himself and devoted all his time. The sold apartment, of course, could not be returned. Michael simply did not have the conscience to take away honestly earned and paid for meters from people who had saved for them all their lives. They were not guilty of anything. The only thing the man asked the new owners to do was to take away his daughter's favorite painting and a family ornament. He had carefully stored them for many years in a locked cache that no one knew about. Fortunately, the new owners had no money for renovation, and there was no need for it. The sold apartment was in perfect condition. You could live in it for many years without investing anything. Therefore, the new owners did not touch the stash. They simply did not find it. And the memory of his beloved wife was preserved. And for Michael, there was nothing more precious than these things. When all family problems and vicissitudes finally ended, Kathy could go back home with peace of mind. Now she would no longer have to worry about her father and Liam's brother, and she would no longer have to worry about her security team. She was sure that nothing bad would ever happen to them again. Life was slowly getting better. Now Ethan could take care of his father not only morally, but also financially. After years of wandering uncertainty, he was finally able to get back on his feet. And this could not but please Michael, who regularly came to his beloved wife's grave to have heart-to-heart talks with her and tell her that she could be proud of her son. The woman had dreamed so much about it, but unfortunately did not live to see this bright day, when Ethan became a support for the family, not the other way around. Michael did not forget about Adriana, who pulled him from the other side of the world. If it were not for her, not her sensitivity, kindness, there is no telling what would have happened to him. Most likely, the man would not have been alive long ago. After such severe injuries, which he received as a result of the skirmish with a group of homeless people, without proper medical care, it would simply be impossible to survive. And Adriana, though by deceit, but still forced her to render a helping hand to a simple vagrant, who at that moment was balancing on the brink of life and death, took him to her. When the doctor cold-bloodedly, indifferently demanded that he, wounded and barely standing on his feet, left the ward. Such a great deed cannot be forgotten. Michael owed Adriana his life and always remembered it. Kathy was not left in debt either, who immediately thanked both Adriana and Betty for sheltering and nursing her father back to health. In addition to the financial thanks, which Adriana had refused to give, Kathy asked Liam to help the girl with her education and subsequent employment. She was convinced that Adriana's dismissal was completely unfair. She had saved the life of a man who was going to be thrown out of the hospital like a dog, and instead of being rewarded and promoted, she had been thrown out the door without any opportunity to pursue the medical career she had dreamed of and aspired to. It was wrong, and Kathy felt it was her duty to make it right. But Adriana's reaction stunned her. The girl forbade anything to be done in that direction. She confessed to Kathy that she never wanted to be a doctor. After all these events, Adriana thought about it for a long time and came to the conclusion that she had followed her mother's advice, indulging her fears and concerns rather than listening to herself and her heart. Probably all this happened for a reason, and it had to happen so that Adriana could think about whether she was living the right life and whether she was devoting her time to the right thing, and to realize that a medical career is not what she wanted from life. Creativity was much closer to the girl, so with the money that Kathy gave her as a thank you, Adriana went to study to become a manicurist and succeeded in it. She worked hard until she was able to open her own salon. The miserable life in a public house was over. Adriana did not even remember them because from the moment she began to earn adequate money, immediately thought about buying an apartment in another neighborhood and purposefully saved for it. And after some time, Adriana along with Betty moved in. After so many years of poverty, failure, and torment, they finally lived in decent conditions. With Michael, mother and daughter were family friends. Adriana and Ethan's relationship gradually moved to a whole new level. How Michael was glad that his son was able not only to recover from all the experience, to return to a full life and find a job to his liking, but also to find personal happiness. The man did not want more. Now he had absolutely everything. For the first time in a long time, Michael was calm and for himself, and for the future of his son and daughter. And all the ordeal had fallen on their heads not in vain. There was a deep meaning in all this, and Michael had long ago realized it and accepted everything that happened to him and his family as a fait accompli. And he was partly even grateful to fate for that.